June 28, 1944. The hedgerows of Normandy breathe smoke. The morning mist clings low, mixing with gunpowder and diesel. American tanks move in tight columns, their tracks grinding through the soft French soil. Each machine carries a white star, the mark of an army that has crossed an ocean to crush tyranny. From a ridge ahead, German Panzer crews watch through binoculars. They smirk. To them, these are Tommy Cookers, Ronsons, cheap toys made by a nation of amateurs. Their Tigers and Panthers gleam in the sunlight, armor thick enough to shrug off almost anything. Confidence fills their trenches like smoke before battle. But the laughter doesn't last. The Shermans come faster than expected, dozens, then hundreds, moving in perfect rhythm with thunder from the sky. Artillery strikes cut through German lines. Jebos, P-47 Thunderbolts, scream overhead, spitting fire on retreating convoys. Within minutes, the field that seems secure becomes a storm of steel. By nightfall, the same German crews who mocked the toy tanks now scramble for cover, their panzers burning on the horizon. The legend of invincibility is cracking. The question is, how did America's mocked machines become the engines of victory? When war erupted in Europe in 1939, the United States watched from across the Atlantic, cautious, unready, and largely indifferent. Germany's panzers had just carved through Poland and France with terrifying speed. The world saw mechanized war reborn. Tanks, sleek, fast and deadly, had become the new kings of the battlefield. Blitzkrieg wasn't just a tactic, it was a revelation. But in America, the picture was different. The U.S. Army still rode horses. Its armored branch was an experiment, underfunded, undermanned, and built around outdated concepts from World War I. The nation possessed fewer than 400 tanks, most of them obsolete tin boxes like the M2 light tank, armed with machine guns that could barely scratch enemy armor. American officers trained with wooden mock-ups. Fuel was rationed. Live fire exercises were rare. When military observers in Europe reported on German armor tactics, many in Washington dismissed them as continental theatrics. Isolationist sentiment still ruled Congress, and few could imagine U.S. soldiers ever fighting German panzers on European soil. Then came 1940. France fell in 6 weeks. The British Army barely escaped at Dunkirk, leaving its heavy weapons behind. The myth of German invincibility was complete. Inside the U.S. War Department, panic began to stir. The Army's top brass, men like General George C. Marshall and General Leslie McNair, knew America's armored forces were dangerously behind. Something had to change, fast. The task was monumental. Design, build, and deploy an entirely new generation of tanks before the United States was even at war. At first, the response was frantic improvisation. The M3 Lee, an ungainly hybrid of old and new, rolled off assembly lines in 1941. It mounted a 75mm gun in its hull, with a smaller 37mm turret perched awkwardly on top. British crews who received early models in North Africa nicknamed it the Coffin for Seven Brothers. It was tall, clumsy, and vulnerable, but it had one advantage. It existed. The M3's brief and brutal service taught American engineers a vital lesson. Speed mattered. Production mattered more than perfection. And while Germany's tanks were improving with each campaign, their factories were limited. America's were not. In Detroit, a new partnership between the military and the automobile industry began to take shape. The Chrysler Tank Arsenal was established, a vast industrial fortress where peacetime car makers turned to building machines of war. Engineers refined the lessons of the M3, merging its firepower with a new rotating turret, better armor distribution, and a more compact silhouette. By the end of 1941, blueprints for a new machine, the M4 Sherman, were ready. It wasn't revolutionary, but it was balanced, fast, reliable, easy to maintain, and cheap enough to build in enormous numbers. Its creators didn't want the world's best tank. They wanted the right tank, one that could cross oceans, climb mountains, and roll off assembly lines faster than the enemy could destroy them. Yet even as the U.S. prepared for war, mockery persisted. British officers, battle-hardened from North Africa, doubted the Yank tanks. German propaganda ridiculed the new design as lightweight and undergun. The idea that such a mass-produced toy could stand against a Panther or Tiger seemed absurd. But behind the jeers, the foundations of something unstoppable were being laid. The U.S. wasn't just building tanks. It was building an entire war machine, one rooted in logistics, repair networks, and sheer industrial capacity. Every factory worker in Detroit, every welder in Pittsburgh, every engineer in Cleveland became part of an army of steel. The world didn't know it yet, but the tide of armored warfare was about to turn. And when the first Shermans rolled into combat, that transformation would begin to show. The M4 Sherman was never meant to be a monument of steel. It was meant to be a machine of movement. When its blueprints were finalized in late 1941, the U.S. was preparing for a war it had not yet entered. The designers at the Ordnance Department knew their priorities. Build something soldiers could depend on, mechanics could fix in the field, and factories could produce by the tens of thousands. The result was practical genius. The Sherman weighed around 30 tons, light compared to the German Panthers, but it was fast, averaging 25 to 30 miles per hour on rough ground. Its 75mm gun wasn't the most powerful, but it could fire a wide range of shells, armor-piercing, high-explosive smoke. Against soft targets, infantry, anti-tank guns, bunkers, it was devastating. And perhaps most importantly, the Sherman almost never broke down. In the eyes of its engineers, the Sherman wasn't just a tank, it was a system. Its standardized components could be swapped between models. Its engine, whether radial or diesel, was easy to replace. Its tracks and suspension were built for endurance. Crews loved it for its predictability. They could trust it to start every morning, to climb a hill without stalling, to keep fighting when others stalled or sank. But the real revolution was not the machine. It was the production behind it. By 1942, as American factories roared into life, President Roosevelt's arsenal of democracy became a living reality. Car companies like Ford, Chrysler, and General Motors retooled overnight to churn out tanks. By the time Allied troops stormed North Africa in Operation Torch, November 1942, over 4,000 Shermans had already been produced. In contrast, Germany, reliant on smaller, specialized manufacturers, was struggling to replace even a fraction of its armored losses. Every Tiger that left a German plant took weeks of precision labor. Every Sherman took hours. Quantity had become a weapon. When the first M4s met Rommel's Afrika Korps in Tunisia, their reputation was tested in fire. German Panzer IVs and 88mm guns could still tear through them, but the Shermans kept coming. For every one destroyed, another seemed to appear over the dunes. American mechanics fixed damaged tanks within hours. Spare parts were never far away. And unlike the German war machine, dependent on rail lines and dwindling fuel, The U.S. could resupply almost anywhere. The lesson was clear. The Allies could absorb losses and keep advancing. The Axis could not. Through 1943, Sherman variants multiplied. The M4A1 with its rounded cast hull, the M4A3 with a new Ford engine, the M4A4 built for British Lend-Lease. In Soviet hands, Shermans rolled on the Eastern Front. In British service, they stormed through Italy. This was no longer just a tank, it was a global weapon platform. And yet, even as it proved its worth, whispers persisted among Allied crews. Facing new German beasts like the Tiger and Panther, many felt outgunned. The Tiger's 88mm cannon could destroy a Sherman at 2 kilometers. The Sherman's gun had to close in dangerously close to penetrate German armor. American tankers knew the odds, but they also knew their strength: speed, coordination, and communication. For every Tiger on the field, there were often 10 Shermans. And when they worked together with artillery, air support, and infantry, they became a machine greater than any single tank. By the time the invasion of Normandy loomed in mid-1944, production had reached staggering heights. Over 40,000 Shermans built. New versions carried the long-barreled 76mm gun or the British Firefly conversion with a deadly 17-pounder cannon, finally capable of piercing a tiger's hide. They would be the steel spearhead of Operation Overlord. The Germans still laughed. They saw the Sherman as soft, slow, and naive, a tank for amateurs. But deep inside Allied planning rooms, officers like General Omar Bradley and General Patton saw it differently. They knew the Sherman's greatest strength wasn't its armor. It was its ability to be everywhere, to move, to fight in numbers, and to never stop. On June 6, 1944, when the first waves of Allied armor rolled onto French soil, that philosophy would be tested on a scale never seen before. The world was about to witness what industrial war truly meant. The mocking voices would soon fall silent. Every Sherman crew carried 5 men, 5 beating hearts sealed inside a roaring furnace of steel. There was the commander, perched in the turret, scanning the horizon. The gunner, his eye pressed to the sight, fingers tense on the trigger. The loader, sweating and swearing as he rammed shell after shell into the breach. The driver and co-driver below, cramped in the hull, steering through mud and terror. They knew what the Germans said about them: Tommy Cookers, Ronsons, Shermans always light first. And sometimes they did. When hit by an 88mm shell, the Sherman's gasoline engine could ignite like a torch. Many crews learned to hate that sound, the hollow clank of a round striking armor, followed by silence, then flame. Yet fear became routine. Crews customized their tanks with names painted across the barrels: Lucky Lady, Sweet Sue, Battlin' Baby. They welded extra track links to the hull for makeshift protection, packed sandbags around the turret, stuffed the floor with shell casings for insulation. It wasn't regulation, it was survival. What outsiders rarely understood was the bond inside those steel coffins. Each man depended on the others completely. If one froze, they all died. If one was quick, they might all live. And when a Sherman was knocked out, it wasn't just metal that burned. It was friendship, memory, and the shared understanding that war was never fair. The crews knew the odds. They faced heavier guns, thicker armor, and experienced opponents. But they also knew something the enemy didn't. Their side could afford to come back. They would lose tanks, but they wouldn't lose momentum. Critics often compared the Sherman to German tanks in isolation, a Panther's 75 mm gun, a Tiger's armor. But that comparison missed the point. The M4 wasn't designed to outmatch. It was designed to outlast. Its 75 mm gun had a high explosive round that could devastate anti-tank positions and infantry, the kind of flexibility German crews lacked. The stabilizer, a small mechanical marvel, allowed the gunner to fire accurately while moving, a revolutionary advantage in mobile warfare. The transmission rarely failed. The suspension absorbed punishment for miles. When a Sherman broke down, crews could fix it in hours. When a Panther broke down, which it often did, it could take days. Many German tanks were lost not to enemy fire, but to engine failure, fuel shortages, or abandonment. The Sherman's shape, tall and rounded, gave it a distinctive silhouette, often criticized as an easy target. But that dome-shaped armor deflected shells better than flat plates. Its compact turret allowed quick traverse and faster target acquisition. And later models, like the M4 A3E8 Easy 8, offered improved suspension and a more powerful 76 mm gun, closing the firepower gap. Its secret weapon, however, was adaptability. The Sherman served as a gun tank, recovery vehicle, amphibious DD tank, flamethrower Zippo, mine clearer Crab, and bridge layer. No other tank of the war could do so many jobs so well. It wasn't perfection, it was versatility turned into strategy. While German tank factories worked like watchmakers, American plants worked like clockwork. In Detroit, the Chrysler tank arsenal spread across 113 acres of concrete and steel. Conveyor belts, welding sparks, and roaring furnaces replaced the silence of peacetime industry. Entire trainloads of Shermans left every week, each ready to join the front. By 1943, American industry was producing one Sherman every 5 minutes. It wasn't artistry, it was arithmetic. Each tank was the sum of a national effort: steel from Pennsylvania, engines from Ford, optics from Massachusetts, rubber from Louisiana. Even farmers and homemakers became part of the war machine, collecting scrap metal and rationing rubber for treads. The United States had turned its entire society into a manufacturing weapon. This industrial philosophy extended to logistics. When a Sherman was destroyed, another could replace it within days. Spare parts were everywhere. The Germans might field a dozen Tigers in a battalion. America could field hundreds of Shermans in a single corps. Quantity, when combined with reliability, became a form of quality. And while the German army struggled to feed its war machine, the U.S. Army fed its tanks like clockwork. In that balance, not in armor thickness or muzzle velocity, lay the true strength of the Sherman. It wasn't about one tank winning a duel. It was about thousands of tanks winning a war. The men inside those machines didn't always see it that way. For them, the Sherman wasn't a symbol. It was a home, a trap, a lifeline, and sometimes a coffin. Yet behind their courage stood a machine designed not just for battle, but for victory through persistence. And persistence was about to meet strategy in the brutal hedgerows of Normandy. To the Germans, tank warfare meant duels, gun against gun, armor against armor. To the Americans, it meant coordination. The U.S. Army never intended for the Sherman to fight alone. From the start, it was a piece of a larger symphony: infantry, artillery, engineers, and air support, all operating as one. This doctrine, born from painful lessons in North Africa, was called combined arms. When Shermans advanced, they rarely charged blind. Infantry scouted ahead through hedgerows, engineers cleared mines, and artillery blanketed suspected ambush points. Radio communication kept everyone synchronized, something the Germans increasingly lacked by 1944, as fuel and equipment shortages crippled their units. In combat, the Sherman's job was to exploit breakthroughs, not seek duels with Tigers. Its speed allowed it to flank, surround, and press the attack before the enemy could regroup. And above all, it had the full weight of air power behind it. The P-47 Thunderbolt and P-38 Lightning were not just support, they were partners. A single radio call could summon rockets and bombs to obliterate German armor concentrations. Where the Sherman couldn't win with gunfire, it won through teamwork. German commanders complained that the battlefield itself had turned hostile. Every open field a trap, every sky filled with American fire. The U.S. had turned industrial warfare into orchestration. And in that orchestra, the Sherman was the drumbeat that never stopped. Early in the war, German crews mocked Allied tanks openly. Panzer officers who faced French and British armor in 1940 dismissed them as lumbering relics. When they heard of American medium tanks, they expected even less. In private, some Wehrmacht reports joked that the Americans are fighting with refrigerators on tracks. But by 1944, the laughter had vanished. The Germans discovered, to their shock, that every time they destroyed one Sherman, 5 more appeared. Entire divisions seemed to materialize overnight. The battlefield, once ruled by German initiative, was now a storm of relentless American movement. Captured German reports after Normandy told the story bluntly. Enemy armor attacks in large numbers with excellent coordination and overwhelming artillery support. Their tanks are inferior individually, but they never stop coming. The Tiger and Panther crews fought ferociously. They destroyed Shermans by the dozens, but they could not hold ground. Their machines, magnificent but fragile, broke down constantly. Their supply lines were shattered by Allied bombers. Fuel was scarce, replacements rarer still. The Wehrmacht's tank force had become an army of stranded giants, powerful but immobile. And every day, the Shermans kept rolling, towing, repairing, replacing, advancing. By late 1944, German tankers had come to respect the M4. It was no longer the toy they mocked. It was the face of an enemy that could not be stopped. War on the Western Front was not just a clash of machines. It was a test of endurance, physical, moral, and industrial. Sherman crews faced a grim arithmetic. In tank duels, they were often outmatched. A Tiger could destroy a Sherman long before it was in range. Many crews went into combat knowing they might not return, yet they climbed back in, again and again. In letters home, soldiers rarely complained about their tank's flaws. They spoke instead of its dependability, of how it would start in the cold, cross rivers, and keep them alive when everything else seemed broken. One gunner in Normandy wrote simply, "She's no Tiger, but she's ours, and she always gets us there." There was a moral weight in that simplicity, a reflection of what made the Allied war effort different. German tanks were symbols of mastery. American tanks were instruments of determination. The Sherman wasn't about perfection. It was about persistence, teamwork, and faith in something larger than the machine itself. Each burning tank, each lost crew was a tragedy, but each advance, each liberated village was a victory bought by men who refused to stop. They fought not to prove superiority, but to finish a mission. By 1944, the war in Europe had become a struggle of systems, not egos. Germany built tanks to inspire fear. America built them to win wars. And soon, the storm of steel unleashed across Normandy would prove which vision would survive. Because in the next chapter of this war, the breakout from the hedgerows, the toy tank would become the weapon that shattered the myth of the Panzer elite. The morning of July 29, 1944, near the French commune of Saint-Denis-le-Gas, dawned under a gray, trembling sky. The hedgerows of Normandy, thick with dew and the scent of churned earth, muffled the rumble of advancing engines. From behind the mist emerged columns of American M4 Shermans, their olive-drab silhouettes cutting through the fog like shadows of persistence. For weeks, these same tanks had been derided by German propaganda, called Tommy Cookers, Ronsons, and death traps. The Panzer divisions believed the Shermans were nothing more than tin boxes, too light, too soft, too undergunned. Yet this morning, they were about to face an unexpected evolution, one that would shift the balance of the armored war. By late July, Operation Cobra had torn a hole through the German defensive lines south of St. Lo. The Americans, after weeks of grinding through bocage country, finally unleashed mobility, the very trait their tanks were designed for. General Omar Bradley's strategy depended not on brute force, but on momentum. The Shermans, once mocked for their lightweight design, were now exploiting it. German Panzer layer units, battered and low on fuel, attempted to regroup near Ronson and Coutances. The Americans struck before they could consolidate. From the air, the Thunderbolts and Typhoons strafed the roads. On the ground, the Shermans moved like water, coordinated, fast, adaptable. Each tank commander communicated via radio, a feature standard in every Sherman but often lacking in the German armor. It allowed precise coordination. A formation of Shermans could pivot, flank, and overwhelm an isolated Tiger long before it could even traverse its turret. One such moment occurred near Le Désert. A platoon from the 2nd Armored Division, led by Captain James Leach, faced 2 Panther tanks entrenched at the end of a narrow lane. The Panthers fired first, their 75mm shells slicing through the hedgerows, missing by inches. The Shermans didn't stand their ground. They maneuvered. 2 of them feigned retreat, drawing the Panthers' fire, while the third, a Sherman Firefly, swung through a concealed orchard. The Firefly's 17-pounder gun, a British modification born of necessity, pierced the first Panther's frontal armor cleanly. Within seconds, the second tank erupted in a plume of fire, its crew scrambling out under machine gun bursts. The speed and coordination of that engagement stunned even the German prisoners. It wasn't brute superiority, it was agility and communication, the very features German crews had mocked. The tide of tank warfare was shifting, not because of a single technological leap, but because the Americans had mastered combined arms. By August 1st, General George S. Patton's Third Army was activated. What followed was an explosion of movement, an armored blitz across France. Patton's tanks, many of them Shermans, raced through Brittany and turned east toward the Seine, enveloping German divisions faster than they could retreat. The Sherman's reliability, once considered its only virtue, now became a decisive weapon. While the Panzers bogged down in maintenance and fuel shortages, the Shermans kept rolling. Their Continental R-975 radial engines were simple, easy to repair, and astonishingly resilient under field conditions. German tank crews began to dread the sound of American columns. The old jokes faded. Reports from the Wehrmacht's Panzer Lehr division described being overwhelmed not by superior armor, but by an endless flow of fast-moving, coordinated enemy machines. On the battlefield, perception mattered as much as steel. What the Germans once laughed at had become a nightmare that seemed to multiply endlessly. At Avranches, the Americans achieved the breakthrough that sealed Germany's fate in France. Streams of Shermans poured through the narrow corridors, bypassing pockets of resistance and encircling entire regiments. German command centers, disconnected and under relentless air attack, lost control. In the chaos, one captured German officer reportedly remarked, "They build tanks like we build cars, and they fight with them the same way. Fast, everywhere." That was the heart of the transformation. The Sherman was not built to duel. It was built to dominate through mobility, production, and cooperation. The same traits that once seemed weaknesses were now overwhelming strengths. From July through early August, over 400,000 American troops and nearly 2,000 tanks surged across western France. The Panzers, short of ammunition and mobility, fell apart under the combined pressure of armor, artillery, and air power. At the heart of it all was a tank that had evolved, not by changing its armor or gun, but by changing how war itself was fought. The laughter that once echoed across the Reich's propaganda channels was replaced with something else: disbelief. The Americans, with their toy tanks, had learned faster, built faster, and fought faster than anyone expected. The true test, however, was still to come. The battle that would prove whether this momentum could be sustained against the most feared armored divisions of the Third Reich. By August 7, 1944, the battle lines near Mortain erupted. What began as Germany's desperate counterstrokes, Operation Lüttich, would become the very moment their armored legend shattered. The German High Command, under Hitler's direct orders, had demanded a counterattack to cut off the American advance toward Avranches. "Drive them back into the sea," he commanded. But this was no longer 1940. The Wehrmacht was fighting an enemy that had learned and adapted. More than 300 German tanks, including fearsome Panther and Tiger I models, massed in the misty hills overlooking Mortain. They struck with precision at dawn. For a few hours, the thunder of their advance echoed the Blitzkrieg years, engines roaring, shells cracking, infantry following behind. But waiting for them on the ridges were not just American tanks. They faced the full integration of U.S. air and ground power. The Shermans formed defensive screens across the valleys, while forward observers radioed precise coordinates to the sky. Within minutes, waves of P-47 Thunderbolts swooped in, unleashing rockets and .50 caliber fire on the advancing columns. German commanders watched in disbelief as their armored spearhead, meticulously assembled, heavily armed, disintegrated under a storm of fire. From the ground, the Shermans surged forward. Their mobility, once derided as a weakness, allowed them to reposition constantly, flanking, retreating, and striking again. Against the static, cumbersome Tigers, it was like fighting shadows. One engagement near Hill 314 became legendary. A battalion of the 30th Infantry Division, supported by Sherman tanks, held out for days against repeated German assaults. Every counterattack failed. The Shermans darted from cover, firing on exposed Panthers, then vanishing before return fire could find them. The Americans fought with machine-like precision, coordinated, resilient, and relentless. By August 12th, the counterattack had collapsed completely. The German 7th Army, trapped between advancing U.S. forces and constant airstrikes, began to disintegrate. Tens of thousands of German soldiers were encircled in what would become known as the Falaise Pocket. Inside the cauldron, the Panzers that once roamed France with dominance were reduced to twisted wrecks littering the roads. The invincible Tiger tanks were abandoned for lack of fuel or destroyed by their own crews. The Sherman, though still outgunned in one-on-one duels, had won the war of endurance, of logistics, of coordination, of mass production. Every advantage the Germans once held had been turned against them. Their tanks were superior in firepower, but hopelessly over-engineered. Their supply lines were fragile, their replacements scarce. The Americans, on the other hand, could repair, reload, and return to battle within hours. In the aftermath of Falaise, even German reports admitted a grim truth. The enemy's tanks are inferior in armor, but superior in numbers and cooperation. They fight like swarms, impossible to stop once they begin to move. That swarm was no accident. It was the realization of American industrial warfare. The synchronization of factories, fuel convoys, mechanics, and commanders all working in a single rhythm. Every Sherman lost could be replaced. Every lesson learned could be integrated in weeks. And by the time the Allies crossed the Seine River later that August, the myth of German tank invincibility was gone. Yet the true climax wasn't just military, it was psychological. For the first time, American tank crews, ordinary men from Ohio, Texas, and California, no longer feared the sight of a Tiger on the horizon. They had learned to fight smart, not scared. They moved faster, hit from the flanks, and used the battlefield itself as their armor. At Argentan, an American lieutenant remarked in his diary, "They said our tanks were weak." But weak doesn't win this fast. The battlefields of France became littered with proof. Burned-out Panzers lay beside intact Shermans, engines still warm. The message was unmistakable. Germany's armored elite had been broken by an army they once mocked. By August 25th, Paris was liberated. The rapid advance owed as much to the Shermans as to the infantry and air power that supported them. The tank that had started the war as a rolling coffin had become the symbol of unstoppable momentum. And in the months that followed, from the Ardennes to the Rhine, that same machine, improved, battle-tested, and mass-produced, would continue its march, crushing the last remnants of the German Panzer divisions. The laughter that once filled the halls of Berlin had been silenced by the roar of thousands of American engines, the rhythm of an industrial giant that refused to slow down. The Sherman had proven not only its worth, but the triumph of an idea, that innovation, adaptability, and sheer determination could turn even a toy tank into a weapon that changed the course of history. Next came the reckoning, the cold statistical truth of victory and loss. The guns fell silent over Normandy's fields, leaving behind a landscape of shattered steel and silence. The once proud German armored divisions, Panzer Lehr, 2nd SS Das Reich, and 116th Panzer Division, had been mauled almost beyond recognition. Roads that once echoed with the thunder of Tigers and Panthers now lay littered with their smoking carcasses. For the Allies, particularly the Americans, the victory went beyond territory. It was proof of concept, the validation of their strategy, their design philosophy, and their production power. The M4 Sherman, once ridiculed by both friend and foe, had done more than survive. It had won the largest armored confrontation in Western Europe since the fall of France. In the weeks following the Falaise Pocket, Allied reconnaissance counted over 10,000 destroyed or captured German vehicles, tanks, half-tracks, trucks, and guns. German fuel depots were gone. Communications were severed. The once formidable Wehrmacht was retreating east in disarray, leaving France to the advancing Allied columns. The contrast between the two armies was stark. German divisions were crippled not by lack of courage, but by the inability to sustain their machines. Each Tiger or Panther lost was irreplaceable. Each Sherman destroyed was simply another statistic in a factory ledger waiting to be filled. In Detroit, Chrysler, Ford, and General Motors were producing nearly 2,000 Shermans every month. Their parts were interchangeable, their designs standardized. Across the Atlantic, those tanks rolled off ships and onto the battlefield with assembly line precision. German engineers had created masterpieces of mechanical art. The Americans had created instruments of relentless efficiency. Reports from the U.S. Army's Armored Force Board in August 1944 detailed that up to 80% of Shermans disabled in battle could be repaired and returned to action within 48 hours. For every tank that burned in Normandy, 2 more were already on the way. And yet, the victory had come at a price. American tankers suffered heavy losses during the initial phases of the campaign. Many crews had gone into battle knowing their armor could not withstand a direct hit from a Panther's 75mm or a Tiger's 88mm gun. What kept them moving wasn't arrogance, it was trust. Trust in their comrades, their commanders, and their system of overwhelming support. Behind every Sherman advance was a web of logistics that dwarfed anything the Germans could field: mobile fuel convoys, field repair depots, and an air umbrella that ensured no tank fought alone. The U.S. Army had effectively transformed warfare into a coordinated machine. In Germany, the shock was profound. Heinz Guderian, the architect of Blitzkrieg, wrote bitterly that our armored superiority has been lost to quantity and cooperation. Hitler, enraged by the defeat in France, blamed his generals and ordered the production of even heavier tanks, the King Tiger and Jagdtiger. But these behemoths, while terrifying on paper, only deepened the problem. They consumed more fuel, broke down frequently, and arrived too late to reverse the tide. By the end of August 1944, the balance of armored warfare in Western Europe had shifted permanently. The Sherman had proven that a tank's value was not measured solely by its armor thickness or gun caliber, but by how well it fit within the broader system of war. The lesson resonated across every battlefield that followed. The Americans had mastered mobility over might, production over perfection, and unity over individuality, principles that would define modern warfare for generations. Yet, for the men who fought in those steel beasts, the aftermath wasn't about doctrines or production graphs, it was about survival. In the ruins of Coutances and Mortagne, burned-out Shermans still smoldered beside wrecked Tigers. Amid the twisted wreckage, crews gathered to count the names that would never return. The victory was complete, but it had been paid for in blood. Still, as their commanders looked westward, toward Paris, toward the Rhine, they knew one truth above all others. The myth of German invincibility had ended where American determination began. And from the wreckage of France, a new kind of warfare was rising, one driven by speed, numbers, and the will to adapt. By September 1944, the Allied advance seemed unstoppable. In just over 2 months, the U.S. Army had liberated nearly all of France, an achievement once thought impossible. The Shermans rolled eastward through shattered towns and jubilant crowds, their tracks grinding over the very roads once ruled by German armor. The victory at Normandy and the destruction of the Panzer forces had reshaped the entire balance of the European war. German morale, once anchored in the legend of its invincible tanks, was now fractured. For the first time, Wehrmacht commanders admitted that their enemy had outmatched them not through genius or innovation, but through organization and endurance. The Sherman had become the physical embodiment of America's industrial will. Its power was not in its armor, but in its presence, thousands of them moving as one, each part of a massive synchronized machine. What the Germans once mocked as a mass-produced toy had become an iron tide sweeping across Europe. Behind every victory, there was strategy. The Allies had learned how to use their numbers with purpose. Sherman units no longer engaged Tigers head-on. Instead, they used flanking maneuvers, radio coordination, and overwhelming support fire. The tank that once seemed doomed to lose every duel was now winning the war through calculated movement and relentless momentum. The numbers told the story better than any headline. By the end of 1944, the U.S. had produced over 49,000 Shermans compared to roughly 6,000 Panthers and 1,300 Tigers built by Germany. The average Sherman could be manufactured in less than a week. The average Tiger took up to 300,000 man-hours to assemble. The difference wasn't just industrial, it was philosophical. The Germans built machines to symbolize perfection. The Americans built machines to win wars. Captured German documents revealed growing despair among Panzer crews. One field report read, "For every tank we destroy, 5 more appear. Their artillery, their air, their coordination, we cannot breathe." This was the moment the world understood the new face of warfare. A system-based war, not of heroes and duels, but of networks and supply lines. The Sherman's triumph was also a lesson in humility. It was not the most glamorous tank, nor the strongest, but it was the most reliable, adaptable, and available. When the Allies crossed the Seine and later the Rhine, the M4 was everywhere, from Patton's lightning-fast columns to the infantry support units crawling through Belgium's muddy fields. In the Battle of the Bulge, the Sherman once again faced the German Tigers in the frozen forests of the Ardennes. This time, the outcome was not uncertain. The Shermans, backed by precision airstrikes and endless reinforcements, ground the offensive to dust. The Panzer divisions never recovered. By spring 1945, as Allied forces closed in on the Ruhr Valley, the last of Germany's armored divisions were shadows of their former glory. Many of their tanks were abandoned, their fuel tanks dry, their crews exhausted. The road that began with German laughter in 1942 had ended with German silence in 1945. And yet, in that silence, a deeper understanding emerged, that warfare had changed forever. The Sherman's victory was not just a triumph of design, but of philosophy. It proved that adaptability, logistics, and mass cooperation could overcome any single machine, no matter how fearsome. It was the dawn of a new era, one in which industrial power and strategic coordination would define victory. In the devastated villages of France and the forests of Germany, the smoking remains of both Panzers and Shermans told the same story: the brutal cost of progress. But history would remember which one kept moving forward. From the ashes of the Panzer divisions rose a new realization. The age of the lone armored knight was over. The age of the machine system, of mobility, communication, and mass production had begun. And at its heart rolled the Sherman, the tank that had turned laughter into surrender. The war had been won in factories as much as on fields, but its meaning would echo long beyond the numbers. When the last shots of World War II faded into memory, the M4 Sherman stood not just as a machine of war, but as a symbol of transformation. It was the story of how intelligence, adaptability, and cooperation could overcome arrogance and design perfection. The Germans had built tanks to intimidate. The Americans had built tanks to endure. That difference reshaped modern warfare. The Sherman's journey from ridicule to respect mirrored the very spirit of the United States during the war: underestimated, mocked, yet unyielding. What began as a tin can on tracks became the workhorse of liberation, driving through France, the Low Countries, and into the heart of Germany. Its crews, farmers, mechanics, and factory workers turned soldiers, learned that victory didn't belong to the biggest gun, but to the army that could learn faster, fix faster, and fight longer. For historians, the Sherman remains a paradox. Technically inferior, strategically unstoppable. It proved that in total war, systems win, not machines. Behind every tank was a network of welders, engineers, pilots, and medics. A symphony of effort that turned chaos into coordination. In the post-war years, as new conflicts arose from Korea to the Middle East, the Sherman rolled on, rebuilt, rearmed, and reborn in dozens of nations. Its presence lingered like an echo of the 1940s, a reminder of what disciplined resolve could achieve. Even today, rusting in museums and memorials, the Sherman still tells its quiet story. Not one of glory, but of grit. Of the men who climbed into its steel belly knowing they might not return and did it anyway. Of the factories that never slept. Of the endless columns that moved not for conquest, but for freedom. Because the laughter that once followed it across Europe was silenced not by noise, but by proof. The proof that strength lies not in superiority, but in unity. And so, in the long shadow of history, the Sherman tank remains more than a weapon. It is a monument to perseverance, to the idea that courage, multiplied by cooperation, can change the course of the world.